If you'd asked me that morning what the most dangerous thing to walk into Nero Wolfe's brownstone could be, I'd have said a woman with a sob story, a lawyer with a subpoena, or Fritz announcing he was out of tarragon. As it turned out, it was a pastry chef in pinstripes. And not just any pastry chef, Lucien Bresson, culinary genius, French-accented tyrant of a midtown bakery empire, and owner of the fussiest mustache this side of the Seine. I was halfway through my second cup of coffee when the doorbell rang. Wolfe was upstairs, pretending he hadn't heard it. I'd have ignored it myself. But Fritz poked his head into the office and said, "There is a man at the door. He says he has a culinary emergency." I don't know if Wolfe heard that or if his chair gave a twitch, but I went to let our visitor in before the word emergency triggered cardiac arrest upstairs. Lucien came in carrying a briefcase like it held plutonium. He walked with the exaggerated dignity of a man used to being bowed to, and immediately declared, "I need to speak to Mr. Wolfe. It is not a social call." That line earned him exactly one raised eyebrow from me and a trip to the office. Wolfe, seated in his throne behind the desk, didn't look up from the orchid catalogue he was pretending to read. "Sit," he said. It wasn't an invitation, it was a court summons. Lucien opened the briefcase with the delicacy of a man disarming a bomb. Inside was a red notebook, the kind you'd find in a stationery aisle if you had no taste and 90 cents. He placed it on Wolfe's desk and sat down across from him, like he was preparing to negotiate the Treaty of Versailles. That, he said, contained the complete recipe for my upcoming pastry line. I call it Le Réveil, the awakening. Appropriate, Wolfe muttered without looking up. Your rival has disturbed my morning. Lucien didn't flinch. It was stolen from my office yesterday. Not the notebook that is the decoy. The real one was identical. Same color, same make. I left them side by side. Someone switched them. The one I now have is blank inside, completely untouched. No fingerprints, no traces. I gave Wolfe credit, he didn't yawn. But he did finally put the catalogue down. You wish me to recover a missing recipe? Wolfe said flatly, I wish you to identify the thief. Why? Not the police. Lucien's expression curled like over-whipped cream. They do not understand such things. They suggested a disgruntled intern. I do not have interns. I have disciples. Wolfe grunted. And your disciples for? Lucien said, ticking them off with pastry flour fingers. Marcello, my sous chef, 10 years with me. I'll meet ahead of R&D. Very precise, very loyal. Gillian, administrative manager, handles scheduling and security. And Jean-Paul, publicist. Ambitious and nosy. I saw Wolfe's nostrils twitch slightly at the last name. Publicists are to him what raw garlic is to vampires. Lucien added. I trust none of them. A charming circle, I said. Any of them ever steal a spoon? Lucien ignored me. The recipe is not merely food. It is identity. Whoever took it knew where I kept the original and what the decoy looked like. It was not random. It was strategic. Wolfe closed his eyes. That's the moment I knew we were sunk. Not because he was tired, but because he was thinking. You are willing to pay, Wolfe said. Like discussing the weather. I am Lucian nodded. 15,000 retainer. Another 10 on resolution. Wolfe opened his eyes. Resolution means proof and recovery. Wolfe turned his head toward me. Archie, contact Saul. Tell him I require background checks on for names. I'll need interviews scheduled here. I raised an eyebrow. We're taking the case? Wolfe didn't answer. Instead, he lifted the decoy notebook and sniffed it. Vanilla. Extract, he murmured. A rather obvious signature. Lucian blinked. You noticed that? Wolfe looked offended. I notice everything. That does not mean I care about it. Mr. Goodwin, show Mr. Bresson out. Schedule the first interview for tomorrow morning. No one else enters the house today, not even the postman. As Lucian gathered his briefcase and stood, he looked momentarily unsure whether he was leaving a courtroom or a confessional. Wolfe had said maybe 15 words to him. That's how you know he's interested. He gets quiet. As I opened the door, Lucian looked at me and said, please tell him this if this recipe appears on another plate, in another shop, under another name, I will know, and I will burn everything. You sound like a man who takes his puff pastry seriously, I said. He didn't smile. Back in the office, Wolfe had already turned to his orchids, but he hadn't forgotten Lucian. When I returned, he said, you may add one more note to your log, Archie. I accepted the case because he lied about the recipe. Wolfe shook his head. About why he came. He didn't come to find a thief. He came to find a traitor. And that, folks, was how it started. With a blank notebook, a bakery war, and a gourmet grudge hiding behind a French accent. If you ask me, nothing spoils dessert like betrayal. The next morning, the brownstone was not exactly a beehive of activity. Wolfe would have combusted at the metaphor, but it was noticeably disrupted. Fritz looked at me over breakfast like I'd invited termites into the pantry. Wolfe had dictated the schedule with the precision of a train timetable, and that meant one disciple of Lucian Bresson per hour. No overlapping, no delays, and absolutely no touching anything edible unless Fritz supervised the handling with tongs and scorn. Saul had come through like he always does. By 9 a.m., I had a full dossier on each of the 4 suspects, their resumes, previous employers, any civil disturbances, and a charming selection of gossip scraped from the fringes of Manhattan's hospitality circuit. Wolfe read the summaries, with his lips pursed like he'd tasted something slightly sour, and then announced, bring them in. One by one, in the order Mr. Bresson provided. I require the scent of hierarchy. The first to arrive was Marcello Di Luca, mid-40s. Italian-born, eyes sharp enough to julienne a cucumber just by looking at it. He wore a crisp chef's jacket, no irony intended, Dan shoes polished. To a mirror, the man was either loyal to a fault or hiding a vault of secrets under that professional calm. We ushered him into the office, and he greeted Wolfe with a short, respectful nod. Wolfe didn't look up from the note he was rereading. You have been with Mr. Bresson for 10 years, yes, sir, and he has trusted you with everything but this recipe. Marcello hesitated. He trusts me with the execution, not the invention. He says invention belongs to the storm, execution to the hand. Pretentious twaddle, Wolfe muttered. Continue. I knew of the notebook, Marcello admitted. Everyone did. But only Lucian ever touched it? I leaned forward. Did you ever see him leave it unattended? Marcello gave me a blank look, the kind that says, you don't understand the sacred nature of kitchen protocol, Mr. Goodwin. He carried it in his jacket pocket. The real one. Wolfe lifted his eyes. So the decoy was, what? Stage dressing. Marcello didn't smile, but he twitched a little at the corners. Insurance. He made a show of writing in it once a week in front of staff. I walked him out and logged the last part of his testimony in shorthand. First impression, loyal, practiced. Maybe a little to clean. Next came Amita Bondari. She was tall, confident, and wore glasses that looked like they cost more than my first car. Her answers were crisp, clipped, and devoid of emotion. She didn't fidget, didn't blink too much, and didn't hide the fact that she thought this investigation was a waste of perfectly good brain power. I'm a scientist, she told Wolfe. Lucian's genius lies in his vision. Mine lies in ensuring it's chemically reproducible. Was the recipe formulaic? Wolfe asked. No, she said. It was poetic. Which is precisely the problem. You did not approve. I did not understand. Amita said with flat honesty. That doesn't mean I didn't respect it. She claimed no knowledge of the notebook switch, no interest in it either. Said her methods were documented elsewhere, and she never saw Lucian's private scribbles. He kept it close, like a priest with a confession. Wolfe grunted. I walked her out. Another one who played things cold, but under the surface there was friction. Something about the way she said poetic made me think it wasn't a compliment. Gillian Markey was third. Now, Gillian was different. She was the only one who seemed genuinely flustered, late 30s. Professionally dressed, hair tight in a bun so severe it looked like it had a vendetta. She apologized 3 times before sitting down, dropped her phone, and then offered Wolfe a nervous smile that could have curdled milk. I'm the admin lead, she said. Scheduling, hiring, vendor coordination. I don't do recipes. But you handle security? Wolfe asked without inflection. She winced. Yes, the passcodes to the office. The building access log. I maintain them. But they're all standard. I haven't seen any suspicious activity. Wolfe asked her about duplicates of the notebook. She swore she'd never seen to. I caught her glancing at the red decoy on Wolfe's desk like it might explode. Nervous, jumpy, defensive. Those weren't signs of guilt necessarily, but they were definitely signs of something. Jean-Paul Marchand arrived last. Tall, tanned, and tailored. The kind of guy who makes eye contact like it's a branding opportunity. He shook my hand with 2 hands and smiled at Wolfe like he expected a headshot afterward. I'm the publicist, he said, in a voice that could have sold Sofels to a steakhouse. I spin stories. I protect the brand. Wolfe looked at him with pure contempt. And you imagine this? He gestured vaguely at the notebook. Is a story? Jean-Paul shrugged. If it leaks, it will be either Lucian's been sabotaged, or the genius is playing a deeper game. Either way, people will eat it up, literally. He denied everything, of course, said he didn't even know about the decoy, let alone the original. But he talked too much, described the bakery's inner workings with a level of detail that suggested he'd spent more time lurking in the kitchen than he'd admit. Also, he complimented Fritz's coffee, which told me he was either desperate for approval or pathologically dishonest. By the time the parade was done, Wolfe had returned to silence. He let the quiet stretch out as long as a piano wire before, finally saying, for interviews, for lies, for omissions, which one did it? I asked. He closed his eyes, all four, in their own way, but only one had motive beyond fear, and the others, loyalty, resentment, ambition, Wolfe said. But only one had desperation. I looked at the notebook on the desk. It hadn't moved, but I swear it was starting to sweat. Wolfe tapped it once, as if addressing an accomplice. Someone took the recipe, he said softly, but someone else planted the decoy. And just like that, our suspect list doubled without anyone else walking through the door. When Wolfe says something, like our suspect list has doubled, it's not hyperbole. It means we're in for a longer week, a more painful grocery bill, and a whole lot more people stomping across the sacred floors of the brownstone. But that afternoon, he didn't expand the list by bringing in new suspects, he expanded it by slicing up the existing ones and exposing their second layers, like peeling the skin off a particularly smug onion. After the fourth interview, Wolfe had gone upstairs to pretend he wasn't thinking, which in Wolfe terms meant he was thinking very hard while soaking in a tub and sipping beer brewed to medieval specifications. I, on the other hand, had a call to make. I rang Saul Panzer and asked him to do another round of checks. Not the kind you find in legal databases, but the kind you get from talking to the dishwashers, the dry goods delivery guys, and the overworked hostess who's been nursing a grudge since Valentine's Day. 2 days, Saul said. Maybe less if I skip lunch. Blasphemy, I told him. Wolfe would consider that sacrilege. He's not my boss, Saul replied, and hung up. That evening, I decided to take the direct approach and go sniff the frosting myself. I headed down to Patisserie Bresson, the sleek, glass-walled temple to baked perfection where Lucien held culinary court. If the place was any shinnier, it would have required sunglasses and a mop. Staff in identical black uniforms moved like stagehands during a matinee fast, efficient, emotionless. I introduced myself at the front and asked for the assistant manager. A bored-looking woman checked a schedule, gave me a once-over, and told me Gillian would be with me shortly. Gillian showed up 10 minutes later looking even more rattled than she had in Wolfe's office. Her blouse was untucked, her hair a little frayed at the temples, and she had that tired look of someone whose boss is currently turning the heat up on a very expensive oven. Mr. Goodwin, she said, forcing a smile. I really don't know what else I can tell you. Then let's pretend I'm not a detective and you're not under scrutiny. Just show me where Lucien kept the notebook. Her eyes flicked to the side, just once. The real one? Sure, I said, or the decoy, whichever you feel least nervous about. She led me through a side door into a small office behind the kitchen. It was spotless, Not just clean, ritually clean. There were file drawers, a long stainless steel desk, and a shelf of cookbooks that looked like they'd been organized by a Talmudic scholar with OCD. In the center of the desk was a shallow drawer. She pulled it open slowly. This was where he kept it. The decoy. He made sure to be seen putting it here, locking it with a padlock, then carrying the key on a chain around his neck. No cameras? I asked. Lucian hated surveillance, said it was for people without instincts. I scanned the room. There was nothing, no cameras, no motion sensors, no hidden panels. The place might as well have been a church confessional. And this drawer, how often was it opened? Once a week, every Sunday, Gillian said. He would sit here for an hour with the notebook. Said he was refining details. Then he'd put it back. Did you ever see him write in it? She hesitated. Not really. The door would usually be closed. I crouched next to the drawer and checked the edges. There were faint scratches on the underside, thin ones, parallel. I filed that away and stood. Mind if I take a peek in? The kitchen, she led me out, clearly eager to be done. The kitchen was a gleaming landscape of brushed steel, copper pots, and refrigerated counters. Armita was in the corner, examining what looked like a pastry shell under a magnifying glass, like it was a crime scene. Marcello was icing a tray of eclairs, each one identical, like they'd been printed by a machine. I made small talk, cracked a few jokes. Marcello gave polite responses. Armita didn't look up. Jean-Paul wasn't there. He was apparently off, doing something media-related, which in his case could have meant anything from an Instagram shoot to a book deal about food-themed seduction. I thanked Gillian and left the kitchen. On my way out, I took a short detour into the alley that ran behind the shop. Trash bins, 2 crates of spoiled fruit, a delivery schedule taped to the back door, and a cigarette butt. Nothing fancy, just a basic filtered smoke. But Lucian didn't smoke, and neither did any of the staff, according to the file Saul had compiled. I pocketed the butt and made a mental note. Back at the brownstone, I found Wolfe reading an obscure Roman cookbook and eating coddled eggs. Did you know Lucian's desk drawer had scrape marks? I said. He looked up, consistent with a switch. The decoy was likely removed without unlocking the padlock. Tampered from below, probably with a wire tool. Also, someone's been smoking behind the shop. Lucian doesn't. Neither do the staff, exactly. He closed the cookbook and set it aside. That was his version of standing at attention. That is not a coincidence. You think the switch happened during business hours? No, he said. It was done with forethought. A staff member would not risk detection by day. This was done in the margin hours, early morning or late evening, likely by someone with keys and motive. That narrowed it to Gillian and Marcello. Maybe Armita. Jean-Paul had no keys, according to Gillian's earlier ramble. But Wolfe wasn't interested in direct accusations, not yet. He preferred pressure, quiet, precise pressure. I will need to speak to them again, he said. But not here. I want you to invite them to dinner. I blinked. Dinner? Here? With Fritz? Yes. Each on a different evening. Let them enter this house on false pretense. Their defenses will lower, their truths will seep. Wolfe, I said, you're using hospitality as a weapon. He allowed himself a tiny smile, as any civilized man must. And just like that, the plan was in motion. One guest per night. Fritz would cook, Wolfe would watch, and I would observe from a seat angled perfectly between the dining room and the drawing room. We weren't just sniffing for lies anymore, we were baiting them. The thief had taken something simple and sacred a recipe and turned it into a symbol. Wolfe didn't care about the pastry. He cared about the act, the invasion, the lie baked into the sugar. And I had the feeling that once this plan started, someone was going to crack, not from heat, but from hunger. Dinner at the brownstone is never just dinner. When Wolfe plays host, it's an event. The quiet ticking of clocks, the crisp clink of silverware, the soft murmurs of Fritz in the kitchenette all adds up to a carefully orchestrated performance, where the main course is never just food. It's a stage, a slow-burn interrogation, where every question is flavored with sauce and every word lingers like wine. The first evening was Marcello. I didn't need to play any games with him. His was the kind of presence that filled the room without needing to shout. As he stepped into the brownstone, the usual polite calm faded, and the air shifted. He wasn't just a chef. He was a man who was used to running things, to controlling what was in front of him. Dinner would be a challenge for him. Mr. Goodwin, he said, glancing around the entryway. Mr. Wolfe. I gestured for him to follow me into the dining room. He's upstairs. You know the drill. Marcello was a man of few words at dinner. Fritz served him a perfect appetizer, followed by a delicate main course of rack of lamb. Marcello ate it as though it were an act of worship. He wasn't the kind to talk between bites unless there was a motive. It wasn't hard to see that. He found this dinner a waste of time, which made it all the more interesting. Wolfe would pull the trigger soon enough. The atmosphere was thick with silence as Marcello cut into his meat. Wolfe's eyes were fixed on him from across the room, a silent judge waiting for a confession. I sat back, watching the drama unfold. Marcello shifted his weight, taking another bite, then another. His eyes darted toward the door twice, a nervous tick that betrayed his thoughts. He wasn't as cool as he appeared. So, I said, breaking the silence, what do you think about Lucien's situation? Marcello didn't look up, but his jaw tightened slightly. He's a perfectionist. It's what made him successful, and what makes him insufferable. Sounds like you don't admire him. Marcello set down his fork. I respect his talent. I don't admire his methods. You've worked with him for 10 years. I pressed. Yet you never questioned his methods? Never felt like he was crossing a line? Lucien's line is thin, Marcello said softly, staring down at his plate. But I always followed it. That's why he's still the boss. Not because of his creativity, but because he makes the rules. And you just follow? I follow, Marcello said, his eyes meeting mine for the first time, until it goes too far. And this recipe? I asked. Does it go too far? Marcello's eyes flickered with something between fear and regret. But he swallowed and composed himself. It's just food. But for Lucien, it's everything. His words lingered, and for a moment, I wondered if they were a clue or just a hollow statement. I wasn't sure yet, but I would return to it later. Marcello finished his meal in silence, and I let the weight of the conversation hang there, unanswered. Once he finished, he stood up quickly, as if to escape the air in the room. "Thank you for dinner," he said, his voice clipped, before walking toward the door. "You're welcome, Marcello," I said, watching him leave. Wolfe hadn't even touched his food, not once. The second evening's guest was Amita Bondari, and her rival was markedly different. She entered the brownstone with all the self-assuredness of someone used to being in control of every situation, and she moved with purpose. No hesitation, no uncertainty, just a woman who commanded respect, who had never been in a situation where she wasn't the one pulling the strings. Wolfe barely acknowledged her as she entered. He had positioned himself in his favorite chair, staring out the window with a deliberate slowness that indicated the evening would go according to his pace, not hers. She, however, was unfazed by Wolfe's nonchalance. She strode into the room, as though she owned it, her dark eyes scanning the surroundings with an analytical calm. Dinner was a quiet affair. Amita didn't waste time with small talk. As the first course of foie gras and roasted beetroot was placed in front of her, she leaned in slightly, eyeing Wolfe with a subtle, discerning gaze. "You're an enigmatic man, Mr. Wolfe," she said, her tone cool but curious. Wolfe didn't flinch. "I prefer privacy." "Then you won't mind me asking," she continued, "what your opinion of Lucien is?" "I don't find him interesting enough to have an opinion," Wolfe replied flatly. "Is that so? You've had a decade-long partnership, and yet no opinion." Amita's smile was sharp, like a scalpel. "Or perhaps it's because Lucien is not someone you can control. It's always about control, isn't it?" Wolfe's gaze hardened for a split second, but he kept his voice calm. "Control is an illusion, but an illusion can be useful, especially when dealing with those who believe in it." She paused, clearly intrigued. "And do you think Lucien believes in it?" Wolfe sat back in his chair. "I think Lucien believes in himself. That's enough for him. The recipe is merely his tool, not his end." She didn't seem convinced. "He's a tyrant," she muttered, half to herself. "I've always thought that, but a very talented one." "I've heard that before," Wolfe replied. "You're not the first person to call him a tyrant, but it's rarely done to his face." "Why is that?" She shrugged. "We all have our places in the world. Mine happens to be in his kitchen, and I've made peace with that. But a man who wants to control everything will eventually alienate those closest to him." Wolfe studied her for a moment, then turned his attention back to his book. "You're free to go whenever you wish," he said nonchalantly. Amita didn't linger. She stood up and nodded politely. "Thank you for dinner," she said, her voice cool. After Amita left, Wolfe remained still, his mind working silently, a slow and steady hum in his brain. It was clear from the start that Amita was playing a different game. She was trying to figure out who was pulling the strings here, and Wolfe didn't intend to make it easy for her. She like Marcello, had her layers that needed to be peeled back slowly, not forced. The third evening rolled around, and Jean-Paul was next. The publicist was all charm and no substance. He arrived precisely on time, wearing a crisp suit and the kind of smile that makes you wonder what he's hiding behind those teeth. Dinner was predictable, the usual pleasantries, the well-rehearsed compliments, but I could see right through him. He was hiding something, but whether it was guilt, jealousy, or something more, I couldn't say just yet. Dinner that night was short. Jean-Paul didn't have much to say, which worked in Wolfe's favor. Wolfe didn't press him hard, and Jean-Paul didn't seem to mind that. "You've been with Lucien for quite some time," I said, casually. "A lot of people think highly of you, but there's something off about your interest in the recipe." Jean-Paul smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It's just business," he said smoothly. "You understand, Mr. Goodwin. We all have our roles to play." Wolfe turned his gaze towards Jean-Paul then. "Roles are the easiest things to play. The truth is harder to fake." Jean-Paul stiffened, but he quickly masked it with a smile. "I've never been good with truth, Mr. Wolfe, only with stories. He wasn't good with truth." "All right, but the real question was he good at lying? And did he have a motive to do so?" The tension between us was palpable, but the final answer wouldn't come from dinner conversation, it would come from the actions that followed, and Wolfe was about to push all of them to the edge. The dinner series had been a predictable success, in the way Wolfe likes it. The evening had unfolded as it always does, with the soft tension in the air, the low hum of conversation, and the simmering discomfort of each guest, trying to read the room while avoiding giving away their own cards. But it was the last evening that made me realize just how well Wolfe had been orchestrating the entire thing. Jean-Paul had walked out that night with his usual smooth charm, but I could see through him. He hadn't cracked, not yet, but there was something there. It was as if he believed he could escape the inevitable conclusion I had been walking through. The brownstone's halls when Wolfe summoned me to his study. He was seated in his chair, as always, and his eyes had a peculiar gleam. "I want all four of them here," he said, his voice measured. "Tomorrow. I've seen enough. We must have the truth before the night ends." His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of what was to come. The grand finale. All four suspects would be brought together for the final act. It would be the moment of truth, where everything we'd carefully pieced together over the course of the week would either snap into place or scatter like shards of glass. I nodded. "You're sure about this?" "Quite," Wolfe said, his fingers drumming lightly on the armrest. "It's time to end this nonsense. They've danced around the issue for far too long. Each of them thinks they can get away with it, but they forget that I'm watching every movement. We're no longer playing games." The following afternoon, the suspects began to arrive. First came Marcello, as expected, followed by Amita, Gillian, and Jean-Paul. They were less polished than the last few times, less rehearsed. I could see the cracks forming in their facades. This wasn't the same group that had entered the brownstone a week ago. The weight of suspicion had begun to gnaw at them. even though none of them dared to show it outright. I led them into the drawing room, where Wolfe sat, his massive frame almost too large for the chair. He was every bit the immovable object, staring at them with quiet authority. He didn't speak right away, letting the silence settle between us, a silence that felt heavier by the second. "So, we're all here," I said, my voice cutting through the air. "Wolfe wanted to speak with all of you together. I'm sure you know why. And for the record, no one is leaving until we've figured this out." "Is this really necessary?" Jean-Paul said, a touch of impatience in his voice. "I've told you everything I know. Have you?" Wolfe's voice was low, almost a murmur, but it carried the weight of a man who'd heard enough lies to last a lifetime. Marcello, standing tall and rigid, spoke up next. "We're wasting time here. Wolfe, if you have something to say, just say it." Wolfe's eyes flicked to him. "You know, Marcello, it's strange. You've worked with Lucien for 10 years, yet you still don't understand how little time there is for nonsense." Marcello's jaw clenched, but he remained silent. "Let's begin with the decoy," Wolfe said, his fingers moving slowly to tap on the edge of the notebook that sat in front of him. "It's obvious that someone in this room swapped the real recipe for the decoy, a simple sleight of hand, perfectly executed. But it wasn't about the recipe, was it? No, it was about something far more valuable than a culinary formula." Armita's eyes shifted toward the door. "What are you suggesting?" "Mr. Wolfe, control," Wolfe said simply. "Control is what we're really talking about here. Each of you believes you can manipulate the situation to your advantage, whether by using the recipe as leverage or securing your place in Lucien's world. But only one of you had the motive to act on it. Why would we do this?" Gillian asked, her voice wavering with a touch of fear. "What could we gain from such a thing?" Wolfe didn't immediately answer. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his gaze sweeping over each of them as if weighing their every reaction. "Gillian, I'd like you to explain your reaction. When you were first asked about the recipe, you seemed a little too eager to distance yourself from the situation. Was that an attempt to deflect suspicion?" Gillian's face flushed slightly, but she quickly recovered. "I don't know what you mean. I've told you everything I know. I'm not interested in what you think you know." "Gillian," Wolfe replied sharply, "you think too much. That's your problem. You focus on your role in the office, your place, your responsibilities, and yet it wasn't your loyalty to Lucien that led you to hide the truth. Was it?" Gillian shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't. No, you didn't. Because you didn't need to," Wolfe interrupted. "You're the one who had access to the office. You're the one who knew exactly where Lucien kept the notebook, and when he would leave it unattended. And you're the one who planted the decoy to cover your tracks." There was a long pause. The room was still, as if the very air was holding its breath. Wolfe let his words settle before continuing. "The real motive was always power," he continued. "It was never about the recipe. It was about establishing dominance. You were the one who stood to gain the most from Lucien's downfall." Gillian looked like she was about to say something but stopped short when Wolfe's gaze turned to Marcello. "And you, Marcello, Wolfe said, his tone now colder than ever. I imagine you were the first to recognize that the stakes had been raised. You've worked closely with Lucien for years. His success is your success, but so is his failure. Was it not you who found the decoy first? And was it not you who chose to do nothing? Marcello's face hardened. I didn't have a choice. No, Wolfe replied calmly. You had many choices, but you chose to keep your head down, to bide your time, waiting for the moment when Lucien's empire would crumble. I don't blame you for that, but I do blame you for the complacency that allowed this all to happen. Marcello remained silent, his fists clenched at his sides. Wolfe shifted his attention to Jean-Paul, who had been unnervingly still throughout the entire conversation. And you, Jean-Paul, Wolfe began, his voice almost amused. You've been playing a game of your own, haven't you? You saw an opportunity to manipulate Lucien's situation to your advantage. After all, it's not just the recipe that carries weight, it's the man behind it. You knew that Lucien would protect his precious invention, and you knew you could leverage it for your own gain. Jean-Paul's smile faltered for the first time. What are you accusing me of? I'm accusing you of the same thing you've been accused of your entire career, Jean-Paul, Wolfe said coolly. You've been living in a world of illusions, creating stories and feeding them to the masses. You never intended for Lucien's secret to stay secret. You were waiting for the right moment to spin it into your own narrative. The tension in the room thickened. Everyone had been caught in their lies. Their motives peeled away layer by layer. They were no longer guests at a dinner party, they were suspects in a crime. All eyes on them. Wolfe leaned forward, and the silence that followed was a heavy weight. I don't need to explain how this ends, Wolfe said, his voice low but firm. I have the truth, and the truth always prevails. The room remained still, the truth hanging in the air like a quiet promise. Each of them knew, deep down, that Wolfe had already won. I had been in this business long enough to know when the end was near. It wasn't just the way the suspects reacted to Wolfe's statements. It was the way they stood, the shift in their posture, how each one of them realized that the house of cards had started to tumble, and all that was left was the inevitable fall. It's not often you see someone's entire world collapse in real time, but tonight I was getting a front row seat after Wolfe's quiet proclamation that he already had the truth. The room was electric with tension. It wasn't anger or fear not. Yet, it was resignation, like the moment before a confession is made. Each of them knew that Wolfe had pieced everything together, and now they were waiting for the moment when he would call them to the carpet. But Wolfe wasn't ready to strike just yet. He'd done enough damage. The pieces had fallen into place, and now it was about tightening the knot. He was going to let them stew, let the discomfort build until it was unbearable. It didn't take long for someone to crack. Jean-Paul was the first to lose his composure. The man who had prided himself on creating stories for a living couldn't seem to handle the pressure of the truth being laid out in front of him. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, hands folded tightly in his lap. His eyes flicked to each person in the room, looking for an escape route that wasn't there. I didn't know it would go this far, Jean-Paul finally muttered. His voice was a mix of frustration and guilt. I thought I could manipulate the situation. I thought I could use Lucien's genius to my advantage, turn it into something that would get me noticed. But I didn't know it would end like this. Wolfe's gaze never wavered. It always ends the same way. Jean-Paul, when you play with other people's lives, you end up losing control. Your story might have sold, but the truth always catches up. Jean-Paul swallowed hard, but remained silent. He had already revealed more than he intended. His shoulders slumped, his bravado gone. He wasn't the mastermind. He wasn't even a player in the grand scheme. He was just a man who tried to take advantage of a situation that was beyond his understanding. Armida sat in her chair, unmoved, yet there was something in her eyes that shifted ever so slightly. She didn't speak. Her silence was loud enough to echo in the room. I could tell she was processing everything. She wasn't ready to confess, yet not like Jean-Paul. She was a woman of control, and she wasn't about to lose it so easily. Wolfe turned his attention to Marcello, who had been unusually quiet throughout the entire conversation. His eyes narrowed, and Marcello stiffened under the scrutiny. It was time to turn the screws. Time to see if Marcello had the courage to confront the truth he had been hiding behind. "You were the first one to find the decoy," Wolfe said, his voice sharp, "and yet you chose to remain silent. Why? Why? Not expose the fraud?" Marcello's jaw clenched, but he didn't respond immediately. It wasn't fear in his eyes, no. It was something deeper. It was the reflection of a man who had seen too much and wanted to bury it. The weight of years spent in the shadows, being the loyal soldier, was now pressing down on him. "I didn't want to ruin everything," Marcello finally said, his voice thick with emotion. Lucien's empire, his work, it meant everything to him. And it meant everything to me. I've been there through thick and thin. I couldn't betray him. Wolfe leaned forward slightly, his gaze never leaving Marcello. "And yet you did. Your silence was a betrayal in itself. You allowed Lucien to play his game, but you didn't stop to consider the cost of your loyalty. You could have exposed the switch, and yet you chose not to." Marcello's eyes darkened, but he didn't argue. His shoulders dropped in defeat, and he exhaled deeply as though releasing a breath he had been holding for years. "I'm not a fool, Wolfe. I knew what it would cost me to expose the truth. Lucien, he trusted me, but I wasn't the one who took the recipe. I only stood by." Wolfe's eyes never wavered. Standing by is just another form of complicity. "Marcello, you didn't steal the recipe, but you stood in the wings, waiting for the play to unfold. And now, you'll take responsibility for it." Marcello nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth of Wolfe's words. And then there was Gillian. She had been quiet throughout the entire exchange, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her face a mask of indifference. But I knew better than to take that calm exterior at face value. Beneath it, I could feel the anxiety thrumming like a live wire. She hadn't confessed yet, and there was a reason for that. Gillian wasn't the type to go down without a fight. Wolfe, however, wasn't about to give her the space to escape. "You seem to be the only one who hasn't said a word, Gillian. Why is that?" Gillian didn't flinch. She met Wolfe's gaze head-on, her expression as composed as ever. "I didn't steal the recipe," she said, her voice steady. "But I understand why someone would. Lucien was a tyrant. He used people. He used me, and I had to deal with that." Wolfe tilted his head slightly. "So, you understand the theft, but you didn't commit it." "No," she said, her voice still even. "I didn't. But I did have my reasons for staying out of the way. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't think exposing it would change anything. Lucien was too powerful, too controlling. I was afraid. Afraid of what? Afraid of what would happen if I stood up to him. He wasn't a man you could just walk away from. I couldn't afford to lose my position. I needed it." Wolfe stared at her for a long moment, the silence stretching out until it felt unbearable. "And now you're afraid of something else, aren't you? You're afraid of the consequences of your inaction." Gillian's eyes flickered, and for the briefest moment, I saw a flicker of vulnerability. But it was gone just as quickly as it had appeared. She hadn't fully broken yet, but I could see the cracks in her armor. Wolfe had done what he needed to do. He had exposed the core of their motivations, the fear, the ambition, the betrayal. Wolfe leaned back in his chair, his eyes cold and calculating. "It's over," he said softly. "The recipe was never the issue. It was about power. Lucien never realized that. But you, each of you, thought you could control the narrative. You thought you could manipulate him, betray him, and still come out on top." The room was silent for a long moment as Wolfe let his words sink in. None of them spoke, not even Jean-Paul, who had been so quick with his words earlier. They were all caught in the web that Wolfe had carefully spun around them, unable to escape. Then Wolfe stood up. "I've heard enough. The truth is out. The thief is here in this room. But it's not just one of you. Each of you played a part, whether by action or omission. And now, you will each face the consequences." He turned to me. "Archie, Kit, the police, we've seen enough games for today." I nodded. The final piece had fallen into place. As I reached for the phone, Wolfe looked over at the suspects one last time. Lies are a powerful tool, but the truth, gentleman and lady, is an even more powerful one. And today, it's yours. The final act had come, and with it, the resolution they had all been dreading. The finality of Wolfe's words lingered in the air like the aftertaste of a bitter wine. I could feel it as I dialed the number for the precinct, an inevitable moment, where everything that had been spinning in the dark for days would finally crash into daylight. The game had ended, and each of the players was left holding pieces of the truth that had been hidden in the shadows. There was an eerie calm in the room as the seconds ticked by. No one dared speak, and I could hear the faint hum of the city outside. The usual sounds of life carrying on as though nothing significant had just occurred. But in the brownstone, everything had changed. I looked at the four of them sitting there each, one a different shade of guilty, a different blend of fear and pride. Marcello, who had been loyal to a fault, now looked like a man who had seen the price of his loyalty. Amita, who had wrapped herself in intellectual superiority, was unraveling at the edges, her gaze flickering nervously, Jean-Paul, who had always relied on charm and deception, now wore an expression of someone who realized he had lost control of his own narrative. And then there was Gillian, whose calm exterior had cracked just enough to reveal the anxiety that had been simmering beneath the surface. None of them spoke. It was as if they had all decided that saying anything now would only make it worse. The truth had been laid bare by Wolfe, and now there was no hiding from it. Wolfe, of course, didn't need the silence to make his point. He was already thinking ahead, formulating the next step. He stood up from his chair, his imposing figure casting a long shadow across the room. The police were on their way, but he wasn't finished yet. He never was. "You all understand what has happened here," Wolfe said, his voice cold and deliberate. "You thought you could outplay each other, and in doing so, you outplayed yourselves. Now, the law will take its course." He paused, looking at each of them with a steady gaze, his eyes sharp as ever. "But let us not forget the one thing that binds you all together, the one thing you all failed to grasp. This was never about the recipe. It was always about control. You were all trying to control something: Lucien's legacy, his empire, his genius. You were all willing to destroy him, each in your own way, for the sake of your own ambitions." Wolfe's words hung in the air like a weight that none of them could shake off, and I could see it in their faces. Each of them knew it was true. They had used Lucien as a pawn, and now they were left to deal with the consequences of their actions. Marcello, who had been staring down at his hands, finally broke the silence. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he said, his voice rough with guilt. "I never wanted to see Lucien fall. But he wasn't the same man anymore. He changed. He became someone I couldn't follow. I thought if I could just keep things stable, keep things quiet, maybe it wouldn't all come crashing down." Wolfe didn't respond. He didn't need to. Marcello had already revealed everything he needed to. The betrayal was a slow burn, and it had festered for years. Amita spoke next, her voice tight with frustration. "Lucien never understood the science behind it. He never cared about the process, only the result. I spent years refining recipes, finding new techniques, new ingredients. But he was always focused on the final product, the show. He didn't see the work behind it." She shifted in her seat, her eyes flicking to the others. "I didn't steal the recipe, but I did. I did want to prove that I could do it better. I wanted him to see that I was just as important as he was. I was always the one in the shadows, never in the spotlight." Wolfe's expression softened slightly, but he didn't offer any sympathy. "And that, Amita, is the tragedy of it all. You all believe that Lucien's genius was yours to control, to manipulate. But in the end, you were all just pieces on his chessboard." Jean-Paul laughed bitterly, the sound sharp and hollow. "You think you figured it out, don't you? But you haven't. You haven't seen the whole picture." He looked directly at Wolfe, his eyes defiant. "Lucien wasn't just a genius. He was a master manipulator. And the recipe, it was just a tool for him, a way to keep everyone under his thumb, to keep everyone chasing after something they could never have. He loved the power he had over all of us, The real thief here was Lucien himself. Wolfe's gaze didn't waver. No one manipulates the truth, Jean-Paul. The truth will always find a way to break free. You just have to let it. Jean-Paul's smirk faded as he leaned back in his chair. I never meant for things to spiral out of control, he said quietly, but they did. And now I'm the one left holding the bag. Gillian, who had been quiet for most of the conversation, finally spoke up. I didn't want any part of this. I didn't want to be a part of his games anymore. But I didn't know how to get out. I didn't know how to walk away. She looked down at her hands, her voice trembling slightly. Lucien wasn't just a boss to me. He was everything. I've worked with him for years. He made me who I am. And when he started to slip, when things started to change, I couldn't bring myself to leave. But I couldn't stay either. And now, I'm just trapped. Wolfe studied her for a long moment. Everyone is trapped by their own choices. Gillian, you had the power to walk away, but you chose not to. And that is your burden to bear. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Wolfe stood up again, his hands clasped behind his back, his face unreadable. I think we've reached the point where we can finally say it, he said quietly. The recipe isn't the most important thing here. It was never about the recipe. It was about control, about each of you trying to claim a piece of Lucien's empire for yourselves. And in doing so, you all lost everything. He turned to me. Archie, the police are here. Let's wrap this up. I nodded and walked toward the door, my hand on the knob. The sound of footsteps in the hallway signaled the arrival of the officers. As I opened the door, I glanced back at the four of them sitting in the drawing room, each of them shattered in their own way. Their lives now irreparably changed by the very thing they thought they could control. As the police filed into the room, I couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. Wolfe had done what he did best. He had cracked the case wide open, exposing the lies and the manipulation for what they truly were. The rest was just paperwork. The easy part, the truth had been served. The four of them would face the consequences of their actions. Each one of them held accountable for the role they had played in this tangled mess. As for Wolfe, he would go back to his chair, back to his orchids and his books, and the world would return to the quiet rhythm it always had. But for now, the story was over, and in the end, it was the truth that had won. I had seen Wolfe finish cases in many ways over the years, but this was different. As I walked out of the room to bring the police in, I couldn't help but feel that something about the whole thing had shifted. Usually, Wolfe was all business, calm and collected until the end, when he'd make his final move and wrap things up. But tonight, there was something more profound in the way he'd approached the case. It wasn't just about solving the mystery. It was about the weight of the choices the suspects had made, the lies they had told, and the consequences of those decisions. This wasn't just a criminal investigation, it was a look into human nature at its worst. As I walked back into the room, I could see the police officers standing at the doorway, waiting for Wolfe to give them the signal. They were anxious to move, but they knew better than to rush him. He would let them do their job when the time came. I didn't know what to say to the suspects. They were all just sitting there, their heads low, their minds still reeling from Wolfe's exposure of their darkest secrets. Marcello was staring at the floor, his face hard and unmoving. Armida was looking out the window, as though the streets outside could offer her some escape from the truth. Jean-Paul was hunched over, his hand clutched tightly round his glass of wine, as if the act of holding it could somehow steady him. Gillian, the last one still holding onto some shred of composure, was quietly rubbing her temples, as if trying to block out the noise of her own thoughts. I didn't envy them. They all had to face the music now, and there was no escaping it. Wolfe stood, his massive frame towering over them as he made his way to the desk. I could see the satisfaction in his movements. The case had been solved. The game was over, and he had won. But Wolfe wasn't one to gloat. He never cared for grand speeches or overt displays of triumph. To him, justice was its own reward. The police officers entered the room, their presence a stark contrast to the tension in the air. They moved with purpose, but not without a certain level of respect for Wolfe. He was a man who had seen it all and had a reputation for unraveling the most intricate of mysteries. They knew this was a case that would go down in the books. I gestured for the officers to approach, and they began their questioning. But Wolfe wasn't done yet. As they worked their way through the suspects, he remained still, his gaze never leaving them. I trust you've all had enough time to reflect on your actions, Wolfe said, his voice smooth but edged with finality. Marcello was the first to speak, his voice quiet and resigned. I didn't want this to happen. I didn't mean for any of it to go this far. Wolfe looked at him, his eyes cold and calculating. It's too late for remorse now, Marcello. The damage is done, and you're not the only one to blame. Armida's eyes flicked over to Marcello before settling back on Wolfe. I never wanted to hurt anyone. I just wanted to prove myself, to show that I was more than just Lucien's shadow. You all wanted something, Wolfe replied, his voice growing softer. That's what made this such a tragic affair. You wanted control. You wanted power. But in the end, you were all just pawns in Lucien's game. Jean-Paul's face twisted into something resembling a grimace. Lucien wasn't the man you think he was. He was a monster, a genius. Yes, but a monster all the same. I don't need to hear your excuses, Jean-Paul. Wolfe cut in. You knew exactly what you were doing, and now you'll have to live with the consequences. The room fell into silence again as the officers continued their questioning. It was clear now that each of them was culpable in their own way. No one was innocent here, not even the ones who had tried to deflect the blame onto others. They had all played their part in the deception, and now they had to face it. Wolfe turned to me, his gaze piercing. Archie, do you understand what we've learned here? I nodded, knowing exactly what he meant. This case wasn't just about a stolen recipe. It was about the greed, ambition, and manipulation that had driven these people to betray one another. It was about how the desire for control could warp even the most well-intentioned individuals. Lucien Bresson was no angel, Wolfe continued, his voice low. But he didn't deserve what was done to him. He built something great, and you all tore it down. I watched as the officers took notes, gathering the final details for their report. They were efficient, but they were also careful, taking their time to ensure that everything was properly documented. They knew better than to rush Wolfe. As the evening wore on, the suspects were led away, each of them taken into custody to answer for their role in the crime. I didn't feel sorry for any of them. They had made their choices, and now they would have to face the consequences. Wolfe remained seated at his desk, his expression unreadable. He wasn't celebrating, but he wasn't upset either. He had done what he did best: solved the case, found the truth, and delivered justice. "I wonder," Wolfe said softly, breaking the silence, "if they would have done anything differently if they had known the cost of their actions." I shrugged. "Does it matter, Wolfe? They've made their choices, and now they have to live with them." "True," Wolfe replied, leaning back in his chair. "But it's always interesting to see how people react when they realize that what they thought they wanted isn't worth the price they've paid." I didn't respond. What more was there to say? The case was closed. The truth had won. And that was enough for Wolfe. We sat in silence for a while, the weight of the case finally lifting from the room. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall, the slow, rhythmic reminder that time keeps moving forward, no matter what happens. Eventually, I stood up and stretched. "I think I'll head out for the night. Wolfe got a few things to take care of." "Of course," he said, without looking up from his book. "Enjoy your evening, Archie." As I made my way to the door, I glanced back at Wolfe. He was already lost in his thoughts again. The case just another puzzle solved, another victory tucked away in the recesses of his mind. For me, though, it wasn't just another case. It was a reminder of how fragile our lives really are, a reminder that the things we chase, the things we think we want, can sometimes destroy us in ways we never saw coming. And as I stepped out into the night, I couldn't help but wonder, would any of them, Marcello, Armita, Jean-Paul, or Gillian, never learn from this? Or would they just move on to the next thing, chasing after something else they couldn't control? The truth had been served, but it had come with a price. I've spent enough years with Wolfe to know that he doesn't celebrate. He doesn't throw parties or pat himself on the back when a case is wrapped up. That's not his style. For Wolfe, the reward is in the work itself, solving the puzzle, pulling the strings of deception, revealing the truth. The resolution is just a formality, a consequence of his methodical brilliance. He moves on quickly, always onto the next case, the next puzzle to unravel. But that night, as I sat in the brownstone's quiet dining room with a glass of whiskey in hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that this case had meant something more, not just to Wolfe, but to me as well. It wasn't just about the recipe or the betrayal. It was about the cost of ambition, the way people are willing to tear each other apart for control, for a taste of power. It was a reminder of how easily the lines blur between right and wrong when you're too close to the prize. Wolfe sat across from me, his plate empty, as always. He never cared much for food, not like I did. But I knew better than to press him. He'd had his fill in other ways. His victory was in the silence, in the quiet satisfaction of knowing the truth had been uncovered. "Quite a mess," I said, swirling my drink. "I think we'll be hearing about this one for a while. Bresson's empire is going to crumble, and those four, well, they'll be lucky to find work again. Not in this town." Wolfe didn't respond immediately. He was looking out the window, his mind far away. "I don't care about their futures, Archie. What's done is done. They made their choices." "I know," I said, taking a sip of my whiskey. "But sometimes I wonder, could any of them have chosen differently? Could they have stepped back before it all went to hell?" Wolfe's gaze flickered briefly toward me, and I caught a glimmer of something in his eyes, something that looked like regret. But just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. "Everyone has their price, Archie," Wolfe said quietly. "It's easy to sit back and judge from the outside. But when you're in the thick of it, when you're surrounded by ambition and temptation, the lines aren't always so clear. They didn't choose this because they were evil. They chose it because they were blinded by their own desires." I leaned back in my chair, letting Wolfe's words sink in. The whole case had felt like a slow burn, each twist and turn revealing more about the people involved. But in the end, it was clear they had all been motivated by the same thing: control. Control over their own lives, over Lucien, over the recipe, and ultimately, over the legacy they thought they could inherit. "The one who stands out the most, though," I said after a pause, "is Gillian. She seemed the least guilty, didn't she? But in the end, she was just as caught up in it as the others. She had a hand in the deceit, even if she didn't start it." Wolfe nodded slowly. "Gillian was the most complicated. She didn't want to betray Lucien, but she didn't want to lose her place either. Her loyalty was always conditional, and that's what ultimately made her dangerous. She was willing to stand by, to stay quiet, for as long as it benefited her. But when things started to unravel, she couldn't walk away. And that's when the truth always comes out, Archie. When people are forced to face what they've done." I took another sip of my whiskey, letting the warmth spread through me. The night was growing late, and the air in the brownstone had a stillness to it, the kind that comes after everything has been settled and the dust has settled. But I wasn't ready to call it a night yet. "So what happens now?" I asked. "The police will take care of the paperwork. The courts will do their thing. But what about the rest of it? What about Lucien's legacy?" Wolfe didn't respond immediately. Instead, he picked up a small book from the side table and flipped through its pages absently, as though searching for something. "Lucien's legacy is his own problem, Archie. He built his empire, and in the end, he tore it down himself. The recipe was just a symbol of his obsession with control. If he had let go of that obsession, if he had trusted those around him, maybe things would have turned out differently. Maybe," I said, but I wasn't sure I believed it. "But people don't change that easily. Lucien was who he was. He couldn't have let go of that power, no matter how much he tried to convince himself he could." "Exactly," Wolfe replied, his voice low. "The tragedy isn't in the theft of the recipe. The tragedy is in the way Lucien and his disciples destroyed each other, all for something that wasn't worth the cost. Ambition blinds people, Archie. It makes them do things they never thought they were capable of. I thought about that for a moment. It made sense. The more I thought about it, the more it became clear that this whole thing was never about the recipe. It was about the power that came with it, the desire to be the one in control, to be the one who decided the fate of others. Wolfe set the book down and looked at me, his expression unreadable. This case was nothing more than a series of mistakes, one after another. But it wasn't just the suspects who made mistakes, Archie. Lucien made one, too. He let his fear of losing control cloud his judgment. And that's the real lesson here. I didn't need to say anything. Wolfe had already said it all. The case had been solved, the truth had been uncovered, and the consequences had been set in motion. Now, it was just a matter of watching it all unfold. The police would handle the rest. The suspects would face trial, and justice would be served. But for Wolfe, it was already over. The puzzle had been solved. The game had been won, and the truth had been delivered. It was time to move on. I stood up and stretched, ready to leave for the night. I think I'm done here, Wolfe. I'll let you know if anything else comes up. He gave me a small nod but didn't say anything. I knew better than to expect any more words from him. Wolfe had already moved on to whatever case was next, whatever puzzle lay ahead. As I made my way to the door, I glanced back at him one last time. Wolfe was already engrossed in his book again, the silence of the brownstone settling around him. He had done what he came here to do, and now he was content to let the world keep turning. I stepped out into the cool night air, the city buzzing around me. It had been a long week, and a part of me wanted to go home, put my feet up, and forget about the case for a while. But the truth is, I never really could forget. Not when you've seen what people are capable of when they think no one is watching. Not when you've seen how far people will go for a taste of power. The case was over, but the lesson? That would stay with me for a long time. The final step in any case, for Wolfe, is always the same. He sits back in his chair, calmly dismisses the world, and waits for the dust to settle. It's not about reveling in success or collecting applause. Wolfe doesn't seek recognition. The case is solved, the truth uncovered, and justice is either delivered or it's not. Either way, Wolfe doesn't hold on to it for long. I, however, was left with a different kind of aftertaste, the kind that sticks to your tongue and refuses to go away. The truth had been laid bare in the drawing room. But for me, the story wasn't just about the recipe or the betrayal. It was about the realization that, even in a world full of deception and lies, the cost of silence can be greater than the cost of speaking out. I spent the next few days watching the aftermath unfold, and though I knew it was only a matter of time before the media grabbed hold of the story, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Not yet. The police had done their job. Marcello, Amita, Jean-Paul, and Gillian were all processed, their fates sealed in the pages of their criminal records. But something about this case, the way it had all come together, stuck with me. Maybe it was the complexity of their motivations, all the way their lies and desires intertwined to create something much bigger than they had ever intended. But no matter how I looked at it, the pieces didn't seem to fit the way they should have. It was like a puzzle where a single, misplaced piece made everything seem a little off. I sat in the brownstone's office, sipping coffee, my eyes tracing the worn pattern in the rug. The room felt emptier now. The usual hum of activity was gone. It was just me and the silence. "Wolfe," I said, breaking the stillness. "What do you think? Was it worth it?" He didn't respond at first, his fingers tapping on the armrest of his chair, the only sound in the room. Finally, he spoke without lifting his eyes from the paper in front of him. "Was it worth it?" he repeated softly. "Does it ever matter? Archie, what's done is done. The truth has been revealed. What more is there to say? Nothing, I guess," I replied, leaning back in my chair. "But I can't shake the feeling that something's been left unsaid. Something important." Wolfe lowered the paper slightly and glanced at me, with an almost imperceptible shift in his expression. "You're searching for a deeper meaning in a world that doesn't deal in meaning, Archie. This was never about the recipe. It was about the price of ambition and how easily it can lead to ruin." "I get that," I said, rubbing my temples. "But what about Lucien? What about the empire he'd built?" Wolfe's gaze hardened for a moment, his eyes narrowing. "Lucien's empire was always a house of cards, Archie. He may have been a genius in the kitchen, but he was blind to the bigger picture. He let his own creation consume him. He lost sight of what mattered the most: trust, loyalty, integrity, and in the end, it destroyed him." I sat silently for a while, letting Wolfe's words sink in. He wasn't wrong. Lucien had been blinded by his own obsession with control and success. He had used the recipe to dominate everyone around him. But in doing so, he had forgotten the most important rule of all. No one can control everything forever. "I keep thinking about Gillian," I said, breaking the silence once more. "She seemed the least involved, but maybe that's what made her the most dangerous." Wolfe gave a sharp nod. "Yes, she wasn't the mastermind, but she was complicit. Her silence allowed the others to operate without scrutiny. She chose to stand by, to let the situation unfold, hoping it would all resolve itself. But in the end, her inaction spoke louder than any words." "It's funny," I said, taking another sip of coffee. "For a case that started with something as trivial as a stolen recipe, it's ended up being about so much more." Wolfe didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. "Everything, Archie, is always about more than it seems. That's the nature of the world. People deceive themselves, thinking they can control everything, especially their own fate. But it's all just a delicate balance, a balance that, once tipped, leads to ruin." I felt a shift in the air as Wolfe spoke those words, a sense of finality settling over the room. The case was over, the suspects were gone, and the truth had been laid bare. Yet, there was something in the quiet that felt incomplete. It wasn't the case itself, it was the aftermath, the ripples that would spread outward, affecting people in ways they hadn't yet realized. Wolfe wasn't done yet. There was something else in his mind, something I hadn't quite picked up on, but I knew better than to push him. He would get to it in his own time, as he always did. The next day, I was contacted by the media. The story of the stolen recipe had made its rounds, and the public couldn't get enough of the scandal. The press was already painting Lucien as a tragic figure, a misunderstood genius who had been betrayed by those closest to him. They were quick to pass judgment, quick to turn the case into a spectacle, but none of them had the full picture. I spent the day fielding calls, answering questions, and doing my best to keep the story under wraps as much as possible. It was a delicate balance, trying to protect the integrity of the investigation while also keeping the media at bay. But Wolfe didn't care about any of it. He didn't need the validation. He had already moved on. That evening, when I returned to the brownstone, I found Wolfe sitting at his desk, lost in thought. The room was dark, save for the dim light from his desk lamp. It was the same scene I had walked into 1,000 times before. But tonight it felt different. The weight of the case had finally lifted from his shoulders, but I could sense that there was still something unresolved in his mind. "I've been thinking about the others," Wolfe said, breaking the silence without looking up. "Marcello, Armita, Jean-Paul, and Gillian. They'll all go their separate ways. But none of them will ever be the same. None of us will," I said quietly. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. The truth was there, and it had done its work. Now, it was time for the world to move on, to forget, to allow the inevitable to happen. "And what about you?" I asked, standing at the door. "What now?" Wolfe's eyes flickered briefly toward me, then returned to his desk. "What now, Archie? Now, we wait for the next case to come knocking." I nodded, knowing he was right. The world never stops spinning, and neither does Wolfe. He'll always be there, ready to take on the next mystery, the next puzzle that needs solving. I left the room without another word, knowing that the case was finished, but the lessons learned would stay with me for much longer. As I stepped out into the cool night air, I felt the weight of everything we had uncovered. The cost of ambition, the price of silence, the way people destroy each other for the sake of control. It was a story as old as time itself, and one that would never truly end. And somewhere, deep inside, I knew that this wouldn't be the last time we would face such a case. There would always be more mysteries, more secrets to uncover, more truths to expose. But for now, all I could do was walk away from the brownstone and wait for the next knock on the door. The rain had started by the time I left the brownstone, soft and persistent, tapping against the sidewalk as though it was trying to wash away the weight of the week. The city was quieter now, its usual buzz muffled under the soft hum of droplets falling from the sky. I didn't mind the rain. It had always felt like a natural way to clear the air, to give everything a fresh coat of paint. Tonight, it didn't feel like it was doing the job. I thought about the case all the way home, about Lucien and Marcello, and Armita, and Gillian, and Jean-Paul. I thought about the empire Lucien had built one of food and fame, and how easily it had crumbled under the weight of betrayal. I thought about the stolen recipe that had set everything in motion, about How something as trivial as a piece of paper could unravel everything. But mostly, I thought about what Wolfe had said earlier, that people often deceive themselves into thinking they can control everything, and that once the lies start, they pile up until the weight becomes too much to bear. I wasn't sure if I agreed with him, but I didn't argue. Wolfe was never wrong, not in matters like this. By the time I arrived back at my apartment, the rain had stopped. I threw my coat over a chair and kicked off my shoes. It was strange, but I hadn't felt the usual relief of closing the door behind me. The case had left a mark. Maybe it was because I had started seeing the parallels between these peoples. Ambition and the way we all live our lives, the choices we make, the way we chase things we think we need, the things we think we can control. Wolfe had found the truth, exposed it, and set it all in motion. But the aftermath, that was something else entirely. That was something I wasn't sure I was ready to face. I lit a cigarette. Leaning against the windowsill, staring out at the wet streets below. The world was moving on, the story fading from the front pages, the police doing their job, the suspects facing whatever consequences awaited them. But the human side of the story, the ambition, the fear, the lies lingered in the back of my mind, echoing louder than I liked. I put the cigarette out, grabbed a drink from the cabinet, and sank into my chair. This was one of those moments where the world just felt too quiet. A case like this never really leaves you. You think it will. You think you can just lock it away in a drawer, file it away in your memory like all the others. But this one had teeth. It wasn't just about the crime. It was about the people involved. It was about the choices they had made, the way they had betrayed not just each other, but themselves. The thought lingered with me for hours, but eventually the quiet became too much. The rain had stopped, but I still couldn't shake the weight of what had happened. So I decided to do what I always do when I'm trying to shake off the noise in my head. I went to sleep, but even then, as I lay in bed with the city just outside my window, I couldn't escape the feeling that the story wasn't quite over. The final act was yet to be written. The next morning, I returned to the brownstone to check in with Wolfe. I knew he'd be there, just as he always was, moving through his day with his usual deliberate pace. The brownstone felt like it had a life of its own, a place that never quite quieted down, even when there was no one else around. I opened the door and found Wolfe exactly where I expected him to be, in his chair, flipping through a stack of papers, his mind already on something new. "Good morning, Wolfe," I said as I stepped inside, brushing the rain off my coat. "You seem preoccupied." He didn't look up from his papers. "Always AM, Archie. There's always something else to think about." "Yeah, I get that," I said, hanging my coat on the rack. "But you've been quiet since the case wrapped up. I figured you'd have some thoughts." Wolfe finally looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I've had plenty of thoughts, Archie, but I've learned something important this week. Something that may not be obvious to the casual observer." I raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What's that?" He put the papers down and leaned forward, his hands clasped in front of him. People are never as simple as they appear. They wear their masks, they tell their lies, and they hide their truths behind layers of deception. But underneath it all, they're just people. And that's the part that interests me. I crossed the room and took a seat across from him. You've got that right. We're all just trying to get by, trying to control the things we think we can. Wolfe nodded, his expression thoughtful. Yes, and in trying to control everything, we lose sight of the most important thing, the one thing we can never control, ourselves. It was a rare moment of vulnerability from Wolfe, and as I sat there, listening to him speak, I realized that he wasn't just talking about the suspects in the case. He was talking about all of us, about the ways we deceive ourselves, the ways we make choices we think we can control, and the price we pay when those choices come back to haunt us. I've thought about it a lot, Wolfe continued, his voice quieter now, about Lucien, about Marcello and the others, the choices they made, the betrayals they allowed to happen. But in the end, they were all just following the same pattern, the same hunger for power, for control. They didn't even know they were doing it until it was too late. I sat back in my chair, processing his words. You're saying they were just caught in the system? No way out? Wolfe's gaze softened, just for a moment. Everyone is, Archie. Everyone who thinks they can control everything. We all think we're smarter than the game. But in the end, we're all players in the same game. I was quiet for a moment, staring out the window. The city was still, its rhythm unaffected by the turmoil we'd just experienced. But for some reason, I felt like it had shifted just a little. Something about the case had left a mark, not just on the people involved, but on me, too. And maybe that was the real lesson. Not about justice, not about crime and punishment, but about how fragile we all are, how easily we can fall into the traps of our own making. Wolfe cleared his throat, his voice returning to its usual crispness. And so, we wait. We wait for the next case, for the next story to come knocking. I stood up and stretched. Well, that's always the way it goes. The next case is always just around the corner. Wolfe didn't respond. He didn't need to. We both knew that the case was over. And yet, something lingered in the air. Something unspoken as I walked out of the room. I felt the weight of the case lift slightly from my shoulders. But it didn't quite disappear. Maybe it never would. Maybe that was the point. Some stories are too big to leave behind. And sometimes, the truth isn't just about what's been uncovered, it's about the things that are left unsaid. The rain had cleared up by the time I left the brownstone, but the city still felt damp, like it was holding on to the weight of the past week. The streets, slick with water, glistened under the faint streetlights. I walked slowly, my mind racing through everything that had happened, through the threads of the case Wolfe had untangled with his usual precision. As I moved through the city, I couldn't shake the feeling that, despite everything we'd uncovered, there was still something unfinished about the whole thing. Wolfe had solved the puzzle, laid out the truth for the world to see. But I kept coming back to the same question. Was it really finished? Sure, the police were handling the paperwork. The suspects were being processed. and the wheels of justice were starting to turn. But what about the rest of it? What about the human side of the story, the emotions, the regrets, the consequences? That was always the part that stayed with me. I found myself standing in front of a small cafe, the warm light spilling out through the windows, the low hum of conversation drifting through the door. It was the kind of place that had the kind of comfort you didn't have to think about. It was just there, existing in the background of your life, like a constant companion. I stepped inside and sat at a corner table, ordering coffee without much thought. The place wasn't crowded, but there were a few familiar faces. The kind that you'd see once or twice a week, but never really know. They weren't part of the case. They weren't part of the story that had consumed my life for the past few days. I took a sip of the coffee, the bitterness of it cutting through the fog in my head. I had been in the business long enough to know that cases like this cases, that involve manipulation, betrayal, and ambition tend to leave scars. The truth always comes out, eventually, but the people involved, the ones who thought they were playing the game, would never walk away the same. And that's what gnawed at me, the realization that no matter how much justice Wolfe served, no matter how much truth we revealed, the damage was done. The four of them, Marcello, Amita, Jean-Paul, and Gillian, they'd never be the same. Their lives had been altered, irrevocably. It was funny. In this business, we're used to seeing the bad guys get what they deserve. But when the story's over, there's always that moment where you realize that sometimes the bad guys don't need to be punished by the law. Sometimes the punishment is just living with what they've done. I was lost in these thoughts when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching. I looked up, and for a split second, I thought I saw a shadow pass by the door. It wasn't someone I recognized at first, but there was something in the way they moved that felt familiar. The figure stopped just outside the cafe, lingering for a moment, before pushing open the door. It was Gillian. She stood there for a second, scanning the room, her eyes landing on me. Her face was pale, her hair slightly disheveled, but she held herself with the same quiet dignity I remembered from the brownstone. But now, there was something else behind her eyes, a weariness that came with facing the truth. A weariness I knew all too well. She didn't speak at first, just stood there for a moment, her eyes meeting mine. I raised my coffee cup in a silent gesture of acknowledgement, and she nodded before making her way over to the table. "I didn't think I'd see you here," I said, trying to break the silence. She took a seat across from me, her hands clasped in front of her. "I didn't expect to be here, either," she said softly, "but I didn't know where else to go." I could hear the weight in her voice. She hadn't come here for comfort. She hadn't come here for answers. She'd come because she was lost. "You know, you didn't have to do it," I said quietly. "You didn't have to get involved. You could have walked away." "I didn't walk away because I was scared," Gillian said, her voice cracking slightly. "I was scared of losing everything. I was scared of losing the only thing that had ever really mattered to me." "You weren't the only one," I said, leaning back in my chair. "None of you were. But in the end, it's not about what you want. It's about what you're willing to do to get it." Gillian stared down at the table, her fingers twisting together in her lap. I never thought it would come to this. I never thought I'd be sitting here, facing the consequences. I thought I could keep my head down, stay in the background, and it would all work itself out. And it didn't. I asked, my voice gentle. She shook her head. No, it didn't. And now it's too late. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of her regret. But I couldn't bring myself to pity her. It wasn't my place, and it wouldn't have helped. She had already made her choices, and now she had to live with them. I guess you'll have to face the consequences. Like the rest of them, I said. Marcello, Amita, Jean-Paul. They're not going to get away with this. You won't either. Gillian looked up at me, her eyes searching. You think they deserve it? All of them? I think they all had a part to play in this, I said. And in the end, they'll pay for it. Some of them will face the law, but I think the real punishment comes after. They'll have to live with what they've done. That's the worst part. I don't know what I'm supposed to do now, she said softly. It feels like everything I've worked for has just crumbled. I don't know how to pick up the pieces. None of us do, I said, taking a long sip of my coffee. But you have to. It's the only way. We sat in silence for a moment, the soft hum of the cafe surrounding us. I could feel the tension between us, the unspoken words hanging in the air. But there was no need for them. She knew what she had to do, and so did I. Eventually, she stood up, her movements slow and deliberate. I'll figure it out, she said, her voice steady. I have to. Thank you, Archie, for everything. I nodded, watching her leave the cafe without another word. She walked out into the street, disappearing into the crowd. Just another face in the city. I sat there for a while longer, finishing my coffee, letting the silence settle round me. The case was over. The truth had been revealed. But there was still something lingering in the air, something I couldn't quite shake off. Maybe it was the way people like Gillian and the others always think they can control everything, always think they can manipulate their own fate. Maybe it was the way they all, in the end, realized too late that they were playing a game they couldn't win. I stood up, paid for my coffee, and walked out into the night. The city was still moving, still bustling, but for me, the story was over. And maybe that was the hardest part of all, knowing that you can't change the past, no matter how much you wish you could. I made my way back to the brownstone, where Wolfe would be waiting for whatever came next. The next case, the next mystery. The world didn't stop turning, even when everything else felt like it had. As I stepped through the door, I realized that this wasn't the last time we'd face something like this. It never is. But for now, all I could do was keep moving forward, because that's all any of us can do. The days that followed were quieter than I expected. The kind of quiet that fills a room after the final curtain has fallen, and the applause has died down. The city went on, as it always does, with its constant hum of activity. But the drama that had unfolded within the walls of the brownstone felt like something from another time. The suspects had been processed, the case had been closed, and the truth had been revealed. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. It wasn't the case itself, it was what it represented. The way people can deceive themselves into believing they're in control. That they can steer their lives with precision and purpose. But in the end, it's always the unexpected that shifts everything. The thing that you never saw coming. Wolfe had moved on, of course. That was his way. The case had been solved, the suspects held accountable, and the lesson had been delivered. There was nothing more to be done, nothing more to say. But as I sat in the brownstone, reading the papers and watching the world outside, I couldn't help but think about the people who'd been caught in this web. Marcello, Amita, Jean-Paul, and Gillian, they had each played their part, but they were all just trying to navigate their own desires, their own ambitions. And in the end, it was those very desires that destroyed them. The phone rang. Cutting through the quiet, I answered, expecting it to be another routine call about the case. But the voice on the other end caught me off guard. Mr. Goodwin. The voice was tentative, almost hesitant. This is Gillian. I wanted to speak to you. I sat up, surprised. Gillian, what's this about? I don't know if you can help me, but I thought I should ask. I don't know what I'm supposed to do now. I leaned back in my chair, listening carefully. What do you mean? I've been trying to figure things out. After everything that happened, I feel like I've lost everything. And I'm not sure what's left for me. I'm not sure how to move forward. I sighed, running my fingers over the edge of the desk. I'm afraid I can't give you any answers. Gillian, you've made your choices, just like the rest of them. Now, you've got to live with them. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I know, she said softly. I know. I wanted to hear it from you. Maybe it'll help me understand. I stayed silent for a moment, thinking. The truth has a way of making things clear, Gillian. But it's not always the easy answer. Sometimes it leaves you with more questions than you had to begin with. I know, she repeated, her voice distant now. I'm sorry to bother you. Don't worry about it, I said. You'll figure it out. You have to. The line went dead, and I sat there for a while, staring at the phone in my hand. Gillian had finally asked the question I had been avoiding. What now? What comes after the truth has been revealed, after the pieces have been put together, after the lies have been uncovered? The simple answer was that life goes on. The world doesn't stop. Not for anyone. Not for those who are left behind in the wake of their choices. Not for those who thought they could control everything, only to find out that control is an illusion. I got up from my chair and walked over to the window, looking out at the city. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick with the scent of wet pavement. It felt like the calm after a storm, but the kind of calm that only lasts for a moment. There would be more cases, more mysteries to solve. There always were. Wolfe was upstairs, doing what he did best, sitting in silence, waiting for the next case to come knocking. He didn't need closure. He didn't need answers. He just needed the next puzzle to solve. I sat back down at my desk, picking up the case file and running my fingers over the papers. The suspects were gone. The case closed, and the truth had been revealed. But somehow, it felt like there was still something left to be uncovered. I heard Wolfe's footsteps on the stairs, and I knew the moment had come. It was time to move on. "Archie," he called from the doorway, "the orchid catalogue has arrived. I think you'll find the latest addition to your liking." I couldn't help but smile. Wolfe had a way of bringing things back to normal, even after everything had fallen apart. "Thanks, Wolfe," I said. "I'll take a look at it in a bit." I put the case file away and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. The case was over. The mystery had been solved. But the lessons lingered. People are driven by ambition, by the desire for control, and by the need to feel important. And in the end, those desires can blind us to the truth of who we are and what we've become. Wolfe turned to leave, but stopped at the door. "One more thing, Archie." I looked up. "What is it?" "Next time," he said, "don't let them get so close to the fire. It burns everyone eventually." I nodded. He was right, of course. But it was never that simple, was it? The fire always seems far away at first. It's only when you get too close that you realize you've already been burned. Wolfe left the room, and I sat there for a long while, letting his words sink in. The case had been solved. But the story didn't really end there. It wasn't about the stolen recipe or the betrayal. It was about the choices people make, the lies they tell, and the consequences they have to live with. The city outside the window was still bustling, still alive with possibility. But for me, the mystery was over, and for the people involved. In this case, the truth was now theirs to live with, and I wondered, as I sat there alone in the quiet of the brownstone, how many more times I'd be called to solve the next mystery. How many more lives would be changed? How many more truths would be revealed? But for now, all I could do was wait for the next case to come knocking, because in this business, the only thing that's certain is that there will always be another story, always another truth waiting to be uncovered. And that, in the end, is the real mystery.